life on Mars. There's evidence that life started and stopped a number of times on Earth, in the first billion years or so, and that the conditions for life were horrendous at that time, and the conditions for some of the bacteria that exist today is pretty horrendous. It seems like it's almost, as opposed to being rare, it seems like it's almost inevitable that life can form. So if that's the case, and the universe is really as big as it appears to be, then you would have to assume that there are other civilizations out there that have hit the singularity long before us.
Right.
And another, another way of looking at the singularity was based on some work by a mathematician named Frank Tipler. I forget whether he was a physicist or mathematician, but he wrote a book called The Physics of Immortality, which talked about the ultimate scenario of humanity being that we would merge with silicon, merge with machines, colonize the universe, and that the rate of the colonization of the universe would exceed the rate of expansion of the universe.
My God.
Those kinds of theories also seem to be in a reasonable time frame, maybe 1,000 years or something like that. So, again, 1,000 years is just nothing in contrast to what we think is the life of the universe, which is 13.7 billion years. 1,000 years is nothing. So, if these things are possible in our near future, shouldn't they have happened in the near future of other life forms, and therefore wouldn't we be aware of it somehow, or wouldn't it have either destroyed or transformed our universe the way we think these things will transform our universe? And the fact that the answer is no leads me to believe, again, that there's something else behind it, that there's some programming behind this.
Well, exactly, because, we kind of return to that idea that we began to talk about, that this would potentially mean that we actually are already in such an environment or such a reality. So, again, we would not know at this point. We might be actually have been colonized many thousands of years ago by a different species that are running us on a program for whatever reason,
Exactly. Yeah, and the one thing that you really need to keep in mind when thinking about all these scenarios is that it's very tempting to talk about where our technology will be in so many years, but if what's really going on is that there's some technology that's billions of years beyond us that has given us a construct to live in or to experience, then all bets are off. It doesn't even make sense to talk about singularities and to talk about nanotech and what's the ultimate building block of matter, because it's all just a construct that's put in place for us.
It's pretty interesting, to say the least.
Well, one of the things that, if I may, that I've also thought a lot about is, in terms of evidence for this, is the finely tuned nature of the universe. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of these statistics where, the prevailing theory being the inflationary universe, the inflationary Big Bang theory, that if the expansion rate in the first, fractions of a second of the Big Bang differed by 1 part in a billion, either direction, it would have caused the universe to collapse or to fly apart so fast that stars couldn't have formed.
Right.
Tiny differences in ratio of electric field strength, the gravitational field would have prevented molecules to form. Ratio of masses of protons to electrons weren't exactly what they are. Chemical reactions couldn't form. And when you factor in various probabilities like this, you don't just add them up, you multiply them. And if you multiply out these probabilities, you get an astronomically ridiculous kind of probability that we could be living in what we're living in, right? In the with the laws of physics and the laws of formation of life that we have. And the way that cosmologists get around that is something called the anthropic principle, which says that, well, there must be zillions, and I realize zillion isn't a word, but there's just no word to describe it. There must be zillions of parallel universes out there, and the reason that we seem to be in this perfectly tuned one is because it's the only one we can be in. So therefore, there have to be zillions of others that are dormant or benign, have nothing in them, or they already collapsed on themselves or something like that. So, the prevailing theory is, the prevailing scientific theory is that there are tremendous number of parallel universes. There have to be for this anthropic principle to make sense. They were either, spawned every fraction of a second by this quantum mechanical method, or it's just that our universe is so much huger than we can possibly observe that every possible combination of physical law and organization of matter exists out there in a certain chunk.
Right.
And therefore, so we occupy such a tiny fraction of the whole space of the multiverse. It just kind of seems ridiculous in a way. And I ask the question, which is more simple, that scenario or the scenario that is just programmed this way?
Yeah.
To me, it just makes more sense.
I mean, I guess if we take away the aspect of time, then things become different. What I'm talking about is the idea that it's only when, again, we put a consciousness in there and we begin to measure time that things, wow, this takes 1 million years or a very long time or whatever. But if we remove that consciousness from there, it might be, 1 million years is not different from a second. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. In time, the program model kind of takes time completely out of the equation, because it could be started and stopped at any time, and the construct or the state that's needed to be applied to everybody's consciousness theoretically could be initialized at any point in time. So,
right.
Time, therefore, history is sort of an artificial concept.
Exactly. Yeah. I want to return and talk a little bit about some of the movies. Anyone mentioned, I guess right before the millennium, 1999, 2000, and 2001. We had a few different of these very interesting movies coming out. The Matrix, the 13th Floor, Existence, also Vanilla Sky was very much in this same idea. This would imply that at least someone is, tapping into to the muse of what is happening, so to speak, in the development of where we're going in regards to science. But it also might be that someone is, not potentially warning us, but raising a flag and say that this is something we need to take a look at now because we're coming up to this level in regards to the science. What do you think about all these movies coming out of that, basically same time frame? What do you think?
I think it was actually kind of uncanny, to be honest. I mean, there have always been sort of alternate reality movies in a way, like there was Altered States back in the 80s, and Blade Runner and some others that explore these concepts a little bit. But those three that you mentioned were directly about the simulated scenario, and I thought that was really kind of uncanny. Now, I guess it could be explained that, people in Hollywood talk to each other, and, one idea gets spread around and becomes the genesis for three different movies.
Right.
Or it could be that the programmers were able to kind of inject a little bit of foreshadowing into the consciousness of the Wachowski brothers and the other writers and directors.
Might that be another Easter egg? A hint?
Yeah, maybe it's another Easter egg. There are a lot of Easter eggs. One of them, ones that I think is very interesting is there's a concept in physics called anomalons, and what those are particles that have different properties in different laboratories.
Mm.
So, for example, I'm not sure when it was, maybe the 50s, physicist Wolfgang Pauli predicted a particle called the neutrino to solve an anomaly in how the sun generated its energy. And 27 years after he predicted it, it was discovered. To solve another anomaly, it was predicted that neutrinos would have mass by some other physicists. And then in 1980, evidence came in that perhaps neutrinos had mass. But that evidence only came in the Soviet Union, and experiments done in the Soviet Union. The same experiment done in the U.S. didn't show that evidence. The same kind of thing happens with cold fusion. Experiments in cold fusion work in some labs and don't work in other labs.
Right.
Nobody really knows why. Some people speculate that it has to do with the intent of the experimenters, that if you believe it's going to work, it will work. But maybe that's just an Easter egg.
It might be. Yeah, who knows? That's pretty interesting. I mean, and again, either way, it's a sign that something else is going on than what we think is going on, right? You know, whatever it might be.
What about oil? The whole concept of oil always baffled me, to be honest. You know, some people think it's dead vegetation and dead dinosaurs, and other people think it's abiotic.
Right.
But doesn't it seem to be odd that it would be discovered at a time when we needed it, and it would carry us through a phase of our existence, you know, until the point where we had the means to develop solar or other, you know, energy creation methods.
Exactly.
And it almost seems like it was just placed there for us.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. And I mean, I guess a person with a, you know, religious background would obviously say that, yes, you know, obviously God is doing this, you know?
Right.
So, I mean, we have the two different versions, that this is an experience machine that we are in, or that we have you know, another kind of force overseeing the experiment, so to speak, and making sure that things are at the right spot at the right time in order to progress the experience, you know?
Right.
So let's talk a little bit more about some of the potential paranormal events. That's pretty interesting, and I want to talk potentially a little bit more about magic or stuff that has been happening in the past, that this potentially could be evidence for a programmed reality, and the people who can you know, do these kinds of things, some kind of, you know, magical thing, or even a prophet, if you will, that can perceive future sages or what have you. And there's a different angles to that, of course, and that has to do with, and correct me if I'm mistaken here, but I think that you had a little caption about this in your book about entheogens and even magic mushrooms, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's actually maybe a different category of evidence, and again, not necessarily for programmed reality, but for the idea that there could be another reality out there. It seems like there is a common experience that shamans have, that people who ingest certain hallucinogens have, you know, and psychotics have, schizophrenics, that they experience what they call a lifting of the veil, or you know, an experience of a different reality that may come and go.
Right.
And if that weren't common, if it were very different, you know, the kinds of things that they experience, if it were very different for each of them, then it would be very easy to pass off as it's a hallucination of some sort. And it still is, you know, somewhat easy to do that, but the fact that it's very common, and the fact that they all